How much would you risk if you only had $350 standing between you and the street? Jermaine Davis clutched the last crumpled bills in his pocket as he watched the other bidders walk away from the Hamilton County auction. The log cabin on the projected screen looked more like a haunted house than a home, but for $350, it was his only chance at a roof over his head. Jermaine Davis was 38 years old and carried more weight on his shoulders than any man should have to bear. A veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan, he had come home in 2018 with medals on his chest and demons in his head. After years of battling PTSD and alcohol, he was finally 8 months sober. But sobriety didn't pay the bills. The construction company where he worked as a carpenter had gone bankrupt 3 weeks ago, taking his job and his rented apartment in Chattanooga with it. His calloused, skilled hands, which could turn raw wood into works of art, now trembled slightly, not from the alcohol but from the anxiety of not knowing where he would sleep next week. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced, his voice echoing through the Hamilton County Courthouse. Log cabin with 15 acres in the Cherokee National Forest near Millbrook. Property was seized for unpaid taxes. Condition, as is, where is. The image on the screen showed a solitary structure surrounded by towering pine trees, with a porch that stretched across the front and windows that looked like empty eyes watching the forest. It was isolated, too isolated for most people. Opening bid, $300, the auctioneer continued. Jermaine raised his hand before he could second-guess himself. $300 to the gentleman with the beard, the auctioneer said, looking around the room. Do I hear $350? The silence stretched for long seconds. Jermaine watched the others in attendance, mostly real estate investors and speculators, flipping through their catalogs for more attractive properties. No one wanted a cabin lost in the middle of nowhere. $350, a voice called from the back of the room. Jermaine's heart sank. He had exactly $350, every last cent from his disability settlement and final paycheck. $350 from the gentleman in the blue suit, the auctioneer announced. Do I hear $400? Jermaine swallowed hard and raised his hand again. $350, he said, his voice louder than he intended. The auctioneer looked confused. Sir, the bid is already at $350. I'm also offering $350, Jermaine explained, feeling all eyes turn to him. Same amount, but I bid first. A murmur went through the room. The man in the blue suit, a prosperous-looking investor, looked at Jermaine with a mixture of irritation and amusement. After a few seconds, he shook his head and turned his attention back to his catalog. Very well, the auctioneer said after a pause. Going once at $350, going twice. Sold to the gentleman with the beard for $350. When Jermaine went to the counter to sign the paperwork, the county clerk, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, looked at him with an expression that mixed pity and concern. Are you sure about this, honey? She asked quietly, as he handed over all his money. That property has a history. What kind of history? Jermaine asked. But she just shook her head and handed him the deed. Good luck, was all she said. Outside the courthouse, Jermaine found a group of Millbrook locals talking in low voices. When they saw him approach, the conversation stopped abruptly. You the fellow who bought the Reed place? An older man in a John Deere cap asked. I guess so, Jermaine replied. Why? Did you know the previous owner? The men exchanged meaningful glances. Calvin Reed, the man in the cap said. Good man. Shame what happened to him. What happened? Vanished, said another man. Been, what, Tommy? 30-some years? 36, Tommy corrected. 1987. Just disappeared one night. Left everything behind. Did the police look into it? Jermaine asked. For a while, Tommy shrugged. But Calvin was kinda eccentric, always going on about pollution and conspiracies. Folks figured he just kinda snapped and took off. Well, the first man said, looking at Jermaine with something that looked like pity. Hope you know what you're getting yourself into, soldier. How did they know he was a veteran? Jermaine wasn't wearing military clothes or had any bumper stickers on his truck. It must have been something in his posture, the way he carried his shoulders. Thanks for the heads up, he said, heading for his rusty 1998 Ford pickup. The drive to the property took 40 minutes on roads that grew narrower and more winding. The last mile was a dirt track that snaked between tall pines and ancient oaks. The GPS had quit miles back, but the directions scrawled on the back of the deed guided him to an open wooden gate with a faded sign. Private property, Calvin Reed. The cabin appeared through the trees like something out of a postcard, if postcards depicted solitude. It was bigger than it looked in the photos. 2 full stories with a wide porch that wrapped around the entire front of the structure. The wood was weathered, but solidly built, and the metal roof showed only surface rust. Jermaine parked and stood for a moment, breathing in the clean mountain air. It was quiet here, in a way he hadn't experienced in years. No traffic, no sirens, no constant city noise, just the whisper of the wind through the trees and the distant song of birds. He grabbed his toolbox from the truck bed, practically his only valuable possessions, and walked up the porch steps. The floorboards groaned under his weight but felt solid. The front door had an old lock, but the key was where the county clerk had said it would be, under an empty flower pot next to the door. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing an interior that defied his expectations. He had expected dust, cobwebs, and signs of neglect, but the cabin was surprisingly clean. Not clean like someone had just tidied up, but preserved, as if time had simply stood still. The first floor consisted of a spacious living room with a stone fireplace in the center, a functional kitchen with 80s-era appliances still plugged in, and a small office lined with empty bookshelves. The windows were covered with heavy curtains that blocked out most of the natural light. Jermaine opened the curtains one by one, letting sunlight filter through the dusty glass. Dust danced in the beams of light like tiny ghosts, but something about the cabin's atmosphere didn't feel haunted. It felt hopeful, as if it had been waiting for someone. Going up the creaky staircase, he found 2 bedrooms and a full bathroom. The master bedroom had a bed still made with clean sheets under a dusty bedspread. On the nightstand, a framed photograph showed a middle-aged black man smiling next to a crystal-clear stream. That had to be Calvin Reed. What intrigued him most was the basement. Descending a solid wooden staircase, he found a large space with stone walls and a concrete floor. It was clearly used as a workshop. Workbenches ran along the walls, and empty shelves suggested there had once been a lot of storage here. But it was then that he noticed something strange. The back wall of the basement had shelves that didn't align perfectly with the others. They were about 6 centimeters shallower, and while the other shelves showed signs of heavy use, these looked almost decorative. Jermaine moved closer and examined the wall with a carpenter's trained eye. There was something different about this section. He knocked lightly on the wall with his knuckles and heard a hollow sound in response. His heart began to beat faster. There was an empty space behind that wall. Going back to his toolbox, he grabbed a flashlight and a screwdriver. Examining the shelves more closely, he discovered they weren't actually attached to the wall. They were just leaning against it. Carefully, he pulled them away, revealing a steel door painted the same color as the stone wall. The door had a lock, but it wasn't a conventional one. It was a built-in combination lock, the kind used on safes or in secure facilities. 3 digits. Jermaine stood in the dim light of the basement, staring at the hidden door, his hands trembling slightly, not from anxiety this time, but from anticipation. Calvin Reed had hidden something here, something important enough to warrant a steel door and a combination lock. He thought about the photograph in the bedroom, Calvin by the stream. Were there numbers on the frame? He hadn't paid enough attention, or maybe the combination was a date, the year Calvin disappeared. He tried 1987, nothing, 87, nothing. Then he remembered what Tommy had said at the courthouse. Calvin disappeared in 1987, but it had been exactly 36 years. That would place the date in 1987, but maybe the month was important. He tried several combinations based on 1987, then stopped. He was being too obvious. Calvin was a careful man. He wouldn't use something so simple. Returning upstairs, he examined the photograph more carefully. In the bottom right corner of the frame, engraved in small silver numbers, was REI 542. Back in the basement, he dialed 542. The lock clicked softly. The steel door swung open to reveal a small, dry room about the size of a walk-in closet, but meticulously organized. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets, and a small desk in the center held a lamp and some equipment Jermaine didn't immediately recognize. But it was what was on the walls that made his blood run cold. Maps. Dozens of them, showing the local area with detailed markings in red ink. Pinned photographs showed streams, forests, and barrels. Lots of barrels. Some buried, others simply dumped in ravines. And at the center of it all, a thick folder marked in large letters, Hartwell Chemical Industries, Evidence of Environmental Crime, 1982-1987. Jermaine opened the folder with trembling hands. The first page was a typewritten letter addressed to the Environmental Protection Agency, dated May 15, 1987. just 3 days before Calvin Reed's disappearance. To whom it may concern, the letter began. My name is Calvin Reed, and I am an environmental biologist with a master's degree from the University of Tennessee. For the past 5 years, I have been documenting illegal hazardous waste dumping activities by Hartwell Chemical Industries in streams and on public lands in Hamilton County and adjacent areas. The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing specific locations, types of chemicals, and photographic evidence. Calvin had built a comprehensive case against the company, complete with soil samples, water quality tests, and testimonies from local residents about increases in cancer and birth defects. But it was the last line of the letter that sent a chill down Jermaine's spine. I am sending this documentation as my insurance policy. If something happens to me before this investigation is concluded, please know that William Hartwell has personally threatened me on multiple occasions. He has too much to lose if this information becomes public. Jermaine sat down heavily in Calvin Reed's small chair, surrounded by years of meticulous work from a man who had risked everything to expose the truth, and then had disappeared. 3 days after sending this letter, outside the sun was setting behind the pines, casting long shadows through the cabin's windows, but Jermaine barely noticed. He was beginning to understand why the Millbrook locals had looked at him with pity. He hadn't just bought an isolated cabin for $350. He had bought a secret that someone had killed to keep buried. Jermaine spent the entire night going through Calvin's files. Each document painted a darker picture of Hartwell Chemical Industries and its impact on the local community. There were detailed maps showing dozens of dump sites, photographs of rusty barrels leaking dark substances into crystal-clear streams, and most disturbing of all, unofficial medical reports documenting cancer clusters in the predominantly black rural communities downstream from Hartwell's operations. Around 5 a.m, he found a cassette tape labeled Recorded Conversations, W. Hartwell, May 1987. Luckily, Calvin had left an old tape recorder in the secret room. With shaky hands, Jermaine inserted the tape and pressed play. The voice that emerged was polite, but with an underlying coldness that made the hairs on Jermaine's arm stand on end. Mr. Reed, you're meddling with forces beyond your comprehension. Hartwell Chemical employs 3,000 people in this state. We contribute millions in local taxes. We will not allow some idealistic environmentalist to destroy the livelihood of hard-working families. Calvin's voice replied, younger but firm. Mr. Hartwell, children are being born with birth defects because of your illegal dumping. Entire streams are dead. This isn't about ideology. It's about human lives. Human lives? Hartwell's voice turned icy. Do you know how many lives will be ruined if our company goes under? How many families will be left without an income? Sometimes, young man, the greater good requires sacrifices. Sacrifices like covering up the systematic poisoning of poor communities. A long pause. Then, Mr. Reed, I'm going to make you a one-time offer. $50,000 in cash for you to forget these ecological fantasies. Take the money and move somewhere else. Continue your career. Have a life. And if I refuse, then you'll find that accidents happen with alarming frequency to people who don't know when to stop asking questions. The recording ended there. Jermaine ejected the tape with trembling hands. William Hartwell had threatened Calvin Reed directly, and 3 days later Calvin had disappeared. This was no coincidence. But the question tormenting him was, why hadn't anyone found this evidence before? The property had been seized for unpaid taxes, which meant county officials had been here. Why hadn't they discovered the hidden room? The answer came when he looked more closely at the property transfer documents. Calvin Reed had died with no known heirs, and the property had remained in legal limbo for decades as the county tried to sell it. But every time it went to auction, something would happen. Lost paperwork, zoning issues, technical objections. Someone had been systematically preventing the sale of this property for over 30 years. Until now. At 8 a.m, Jermaine loaded his pickup with the most crucial evidence and drove to the Millbrook Public Library. If he was going to investigate Hartwell Chemical Industries, he needed help from someone who knew the area and its history. The Millbrook Public Library was a red brick building that looked like it had been built in the 1960s. Inside, dark wood shelves held modest collections, and the familiar smell of old books and aging paper brought back memories of study afternoons in his youth. Behind the information desk was an African-American woman in her 60s, with graying hair braided into an elegant bun, and reading glasses hanging from a chain. Her nameplate identified her as Ruby Hayes, head librarian. "Can I help you?" she asked with a warm smile. "I hope so," Jermaine replied. "I just bought the old Reed place and I'm trying to learn about its history. The gentleman who lived there disappeared back in the 80s? Ruby's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of cautious interest. "Calvin Reed. You bought his property? At yesterday's auction. Why? Did you know him?" Ruby glanced around the empty library, then motioned for him to follow. She led him to a small table in the back, away from the front windows. "Calvin was my cousin," she said quietly. "Second cousin, but we were close. He used to come here to do research, use our newspaper archives and county records." "Research what?" "Pollution. Specifically Hartwell Chemical." Ruby leaned forward. Calvin was sure they were dumping toxic waste into the local streams. Said he had proof. "Did he?" Jermaine asked carefully. "He disappeared before he could prove anything. At least that's what everyone thought." She studied his face. "Why are you asking? Did you find something out there?" Jermaine made a decision. Ruby Hayes was Calvin's family. If he couldn't trust her, he couldn't trust anyone. "I found his lab, hidden behind a false wall in the basement." Ruby's eyes widened. "You're kidding me. 5 years worth of evidence, maps, photographs, recordings. Calvin built a solid case against William Hartwell personally." Ruby covered her mouth with her hand. "My God. So he was right all along. More than right. I have evidence that Hartwell threatened to kill him. Have you taken this to the police?" Jermaine shook his head. "Not yet. I want to get a better handle on the situation before I trust any local authorities. Tell me about William Hartwell. Is he still alive?" "Very much alive. He's 79 now, but still active. After Hartwell Chemical was sold in the 90s, he became a major local philanthropist. Donated money to the hospital, the library, several schools. Everyone loves him." Ruby hesitated. "But there were always rumors." "What kind of rumors?" "Families that sued the company in the 80s and 90s for chemical poisoning. Cases that were settled out of court for huge sums, but always with non-disclosure agreements. The families got rich, but they could never talk about what happened." "How many families?" "Dozens, mostly in the black rural communities in the eastern part of the county. Everyone knew, but no one could prove anything because the documents were sealed." Ruby got up and went to the archives section. She returned with a thick folder of newspaper clippings. "I've saved everything related to Calvin over the years. I never stopped believing he was right." The clippings told a disturbing story. Articles from 1987 about the mysterious disappearance of a local environmentalist. Follow-ups in 1988 about the police investigation that went nowhere. Then, through the 90s and 2000s, small news items about confidential legal settlements between local residents and unnamed industrial companies. But it was a clipping from 2019 that caught Jermaine's eye. "Local philanthropist donates $2 million to pediatric cancer center." The photo showed a distinguished-looking elderly man with white hair and clear eyes, smiling next to a commemorative plaque. "William Hartwell. He's trying to buy forgiveness," Ruby muttered, "giving money to treat the very diseases he caused." "I need more evidence," Jermaine said. "Something that definitively connects the company to the community's health problems." "I can help with that," Ruby offered. "I know some of the families who took settlements. It might take time to convince them to talk, but with Calvin's evidence." They were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up outside. Ruby looked out the window and her face went pale. "Trouble," she whispered. Jermaine looked and saw a black Mercedes parking in front of the library. A tall man in an expensive suit got out of the car and walked purposefully toward the entrance. "Who is it?" "James Hartwell, William's son. He's a lawyer and runs the family's businesses now." The library door opened with the jingle of a bell. James Hartwell was in his 50s with the same strong bone structure as his father, but with dark, impeccably styled hair. His eyes swept the library until they landed on Jermaine and Ruby. "Ms. Hayes," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Always a pleasure." "Mr. Hartwell," Ruby replied with professional coolness. "How can I help you?" James walked to her desk, deliberately ignoring Jermaine. "I heard someone bought the old Reed property. I just wanted to extend my congratulations to the new owner." "I wasn't aware you were in the real estate business," Ruby said. "I'm not, but my family has a historical interest in that property. My father knew Calvin Reed, you see. Always regretted what happened to him." Now James turned to Jermaine. "You must be the buyer. James Hartwell." He extended a perfectly manicured hand. Jermaine shook it, noting the firm grip and the calculating eyes. "Jermaine Davis. Veteran? How'd you know?" I recognize the posture. My father served in Korea. James smiled. I hope the property meets your needs. It's an isolated place, but it can be very peaceful. There was something in the way he said peaceful that sounded like a subtle threat. Very peaceful, Jermaine agreed. Perfect for someone who values their privacy. Absolutely. And privacy is so important, isn't it? Especially when someone is trying to build a new life, to leave the past behind. James paused. I bet you invested everything you had in that property. It would be a shame if something were to make it less valuable. Now the threat was less subtle. What could make it less valuable? Jermaine asked. Oh, you know how rural properties are. Well problems, soil quality issues, discoveries of hazardous materials that require expensive cleanup. James adjusted his cuffs. Fortunately, my family has the resources to help new owners who run into unexpected challenges. In fact, I'd be happy to make an offer on the property if you decide it's too much to handle. Say, $50,000, a substantial profit on your $350 investment. Ruby drew in an audible breath. $50,000 was more than 140 times what Jermaine had paid. That's very generous, Jermaine said carefully. But I just bought the place. I've barely had time to explore it properly. Of course. No rush. James pulled a business card from his inside pocket. But if you discover the property has complications you didn't anticipate, don't hesitate to call. It's always best to resolve these things quickly before they become problematic. After James left, Ruby and Jermaine sat in silence for a long moment. That was a threat, Ruby finally said. Yeah, and he knows I found something, otherwise he wouldn't offer $50,000 for a $350 cabin. What are you going to do? Jermaine thought about Calvin's secret lab, the carefully documented evidence, the recording of William Hartwell threatening a man who then disappeared. He thought about the families who had suffered in silence for decades, bought off with non-disclosure agreements that protected the real criminals. I'm going to finish what Calvin started, he said, but I'm going to need help. Ruby smiled for the first time since James Hartwell had walked into the library. Then you've got it. That afternoon, Ruby introduced Jermaine to Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist for the Tennessee Tribune who had won several awards for exposés on corporate corruption. Sarah was an Asian-American woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and a recorder always at the ready. They met at a diner 40 miles from Millbrook on neutral ground where they were less likely to be seen. Ruby told me the basics, Sarah said, opening a notebook. You found evidence of environmental crime linked to Hartwell Chemical from the 80s. More than that, Jermaine replied. He had brought copies of the most compelling documents, enough to prove his claim without exposing everything. I have direct evidence that William Hartwell threatened Calvin Reed days before his disappearance. Sarah examined the photographs and documents, her eyes widening as she grasped the magnitude of what she was seeing. Jesus Christ, she murmured. This is huge. Do you know what you have here? A 36-year-old murder case? That too. But more than that, you have evidence of one of the biggest environmental cover-up conspiracies in Tennessee history. If you can prove Hartwell Chemical systematically poisoned minority communities for decades, this will bring down not just the Hartwells, but anyone who helped them cover it up, including local authorities, especially local authorities, sheriffs, judges, county officials, anyone who looked the other way or actively blocked investigations. Sarah leaned forward, her voice low but intense. I can break this story, Jermaine, but it's going to be dangerous. The Hartwells have connections at every level of state government. They're not just going to let you expose decades of crimes without a fight. They've already started fighting, Jermaine said, and told her about James Hartwell's visit to the library. So they know you found something. That means you have maybe days before they escalate their tactics. How long do you need to verify the evidence and publish the story? With what you've shown me, 2 weeks to do it right. 1 week if I cut corners, but that would be risky. They could challenge it in court. Jermaine thought about it. Do it right. 2 weeks. But I need a copy of everything stored somewhere safe in case something happens to me. Already thought of that, Sarah said. I have a safe deposit box in Nashville. Original documents go there, copies with me for verification. When Jermaine got back to the cabin that night, he knew immediately that something was wrong. The front door, which he was sure he had locked, was slightly ajar. He grabbed a hammer from his toolbox and entered cautiously. The house seemed empty, but there were subtle signs that someone had been there. Books slightly out of place, drawers that weren't completely shut. In the basement, his heart sank. The shelves in front of the secret room had been moved. The steel door was open. The room was empty. All the files, all the evidence, everything was gone. Decades of Calvin Reed's meticulous work just vanished. But Jermaine smiled in the dark. He had been expecting this. The real evidence was safe in the bank in Nashville. What the burglars had stolen were carefully prepared copies, with enough information to look authentic but not enough to hurt the real case. His phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Mr. Davis. The voice was polite but cold. William Hartwell. I believe you had some visitors today. You could call it that. I hope it wasn't too upsetting. Sometimes when people buy properties with a complicated history, they find things that are best left in the past. Like evidence of environmental crimes? A pause. Mr. Davis, you seem like an intelligent man, a veteran who deserves a quiet, prosperous life. It would be a shame if misunderstandings about long-forgotten events were to disrupt that tranquility. Are you threatening me, Mr. Hartwell? I'm offering guidance. The past is the past. Calvin Reed found his peace a long time ago. Perhaps it's time you found yours as well. The call ended. Jermaine stood in the dark cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of 36 years of buried secrets. Outside, the forest whispered with nocturnal sounds, but he was no longer afraid. Calvin Reed had risked everything for the truth and paid the ultimate price. Now it was up to Jermaine to finish what Calvin had started, even if it killed him too. 2 days later, during a storm that swept through the mountains with fierce winds and torrential rain, Jermaine awoke to the smell of smoke. It wasn't fireplace smoke. It was the acrid, chemical smell of something burning that shouldn't be. He jumped out of bed and ran to the bedroom window. Through the rain, he could see an orange glow near the tree line behind the cabin. His tool shed was on fire. Jermaine dressed quickly and ran out into the storm. The flames licked at the sky despite the heavy rain, fed by something more than wood. When he got close enough, the smell of gasoline was unmistakable. Arson. There was nothing he could do to save the shed or the few tools he had stored there. But that wasn't the real target. It was a message. The cabin could be next, a voice said from behind him. Jermaine spun around to find 2 men standing in the rain, seemingly unfazed by the storm. Both wore dark clothing and had the alert posture of ex-military or professional security. Or it could be you. The first man, a stocky fellow with scars on his face, continued. Depends on how cooperative you want to be. Cooperative with what? Jermaine asked, calculating his options. 2 against 1, and they were probably armed. With forgetting anything interesting you might have found here. With accepting the generous offer that was made. With moving on with your life. And if I don't want to cooperate? The second man, taller and leaner, smiled humorlessly. Then accidents start to happen. First small ones, like tonight. Then bigger ones. You've already lost a job recently, right? It would be a shame if your professional reputation were to get tarnished. Would make it hard to find work anywhere. It was a sophisticated threat. They had researched his situation, knew about his financial problems, his vulnerability. Do I get 48 hours to think about it? Jermaine asked. 24, the stocky man corrected. After that, the offer expires, and other options are considered. They disappeared into the darkness as silently as they had appeared, leaving Jermaine alone with the burning shed and the storm. Back in the cabin, he called Sarah Chen. They burned down my shed, he said without preamble when she answered. Jesus, are you okay? For now, but they just gave me 24 hours to take the Hartwell's offer or face other options. We have to move up the timeline, Sarah said immediately. I can have a preliminary version of the story ready by tomorrow morning, but it won't be as solid as I'd like. Do it. And Sarah, if anything happens to me, make sure Ruby Hayes gets access to the evidence. She deserves to see justice for Calvin. The next morning, Jermaine discovered his problems were bigger than he imagined. His pickup wouldn't start. Someone had cut essential wires in the engine overnight. His cell phone had lost signal completely, something that had never happened before on the property. He was being systematically isolated. Walking down the dirt track to the main road took 2 hours under a scorching sun. When he finally got a cell signal, he had 17 missed messages. The first was from Sarah. Story goes live today at 6 p.m. You need to get out of there. Now. The second was from Ruby. Jermaine, where are you? James Hartwell was at the library again asking questions about you. I'm worried. The others were from unknown numbers, some silent, others with heavy breathing, one with just the words, last chance. Jermaine called Sarah from a payphone at a gas station. Thank God, she said when she answered. Where have you been? I've been trying to call for hours. They cut my communication. Is the story really coming out today? 6 o'clock. Front page above the fold. Chemical company linked to environmentalist disappearance and decades of pollution cover-up. It's going to hit like a bombshell. And the evidence is secure? Bank vault. Copies with my editor, copies with the feds. Even if something happens to me or you, this is going public. The feds? The FBI opened an official investigation this morning. Apparently, they've been watching the Hartwells for years, just waiting for evidence solid enough to secure warrants. For the first time in days, Jermaine allowed himself a moment of hope. So we did it. Not yet. They're going to make one last play to silence you before the story breaks. You need to stay safe until 6 o'clock. Jermaine looked around the isolated gas station. I don't know if I can make it till 6. Yes, you can. I'm sending someone to pick you up. 20 minutes. But 20 minutes turned out to be 10 minutes too late. Jermaine saw James Hartwell's black Mercedes coming up the country road before he could hide. The car pulled into the station, and James got out, accompanied by the same two men from the night before. Mr. Davis, James called out cordially, as if they were meeting for lunch. What a coincidence finding you here. Jermaine kept the phone to his ear, hoping Sarah was still on the line and listening. Mr. Hartwell, just making a few calls. James walked closer, his hands buried in the pockets of an expensive coat despite the heat. I hope one of those calls was to accept our offer. The deadline is approaching. Actually, I was on the phone with a journalist. James's smile faltered. That would be disappointing and potentially dangerous. The two men moved to block any escape route for Jermaine. The gas station owner, an old man, had quietly disappeared inside the shop. Dangerous for whom? Jermaine asked. For you, obviously, but also for any journalist who might be considering publishing unverified information based on stolen or forged documents. The evidence isn't forged. Evidence. James laughed. What evidence? You mean the papers that were taken from your property yesterday? Documents that could have been easily fabricated by anyone with access to a photocopier and some creativity. Recordings can't be easily fabricated. Recordings of what? Conversations that supposedly happened over 30 years ago, with technology from that era that would make manipulation easy? James shook his head. No court would accept such evidence. Maybe not, but the court of public opinion is a different story. James's mask of civility finally slipped completely. Mr. Davis, you truly don't understand who you're dealing with. My family built half of East Tennessee. We employ thousands of people. We donate millions to charity. Our word is worth more than that of an unemployed veteran with a history of a drinking problem. How did you know about my drinking problem? We know everything about you, Jermaine. Your PTSD treatment, your financial struggles, the fact that no one will miss you if you just disappear like Calvin Reed did. It was then that Jermaine heard the most beautiful sound of his life. Sirens in the distance, growing louder. Looks like my phone call was more productive than I thought, he said. James and his men looked nervously down the road as 3 FBI squad cars closed in at high speed. The cars screeched to a halt, and federal agents emerged with bulletproof vests and weapons drawn. James Hartwell, the lead agent shouted, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and criminal threats. This is ridiculous, James protested even as he was being cuffed. My lawyer. Your lawyer can meet you at the federal prison, the agent replied, where your father will be joining you shortly. As James was led away, he yelled back at Jermaine, you have no idea what you've just unleashed. There are people far more powerful than the Hartwells involved in this. But his threats rang hollow now, the desperate cries of a man who had finally been caught. The lead agent approached Jermaine. Mr. Davis, Special Agent Rodriguez, we've been wanting to talk to you. I imagine you have. The journalist Sarah Chen said you have additional evidence on your property. Had, but it was stolen. Rodriguez smiled. The real evidence, or the fakes you planted? Jermaine couldn't help but smile. You've done your homework. We've been watching the Hartwells for 3 years waiting for a break. Your evidence is exactly what we needed. Calvin Reed can finally get justice. At 6 o'clock that evening, when Sarah Chen's story aired on the evening news, Jermaine was sitting in Ruby Hayes' living room watching the coverage. Ruby clutched a handkerchief, tears streaming down her face. Veteran uncovers decades-long environmental cover-up conspiracy, the news anchor read. In a stunning breakthrough, documents found on a rural property in Hamilton County reveal evidence of systematic illegal dumping by the former Hartwell Chemical Industries, resulting in the 1987 disappearance of environmentalist Calvin Reed. He did it, Ruby whispered. Calvin finally did it. In the days that followed, The story exploded nationally. William Hartwell, despite his advanced age, was indicted for second-degree murder, conspiracy, and dozens of environmental violations. The federal investigation expanded to include local public officials who had taken bribes to look the other way on the illegal dumping. More significantly, dozens of families who had been silenced by non-disclosure agreements for decades began to come forward publicly, their voices finally free to tell their stories of sickness, loss, and injustice. Jermaine used the federal reward money, a substantial sum for providing evidence that led to multiple convictions, to completely restore Calvin's cabin and establish the Calvin Reed Center for Environmental Justice. The center, built on the site where the burned-out shed once stood, offered free environmental contamination testing, legal support for communities affected by environmental crimes, and educational resources on environmental protection. 3 months after buying the property for $350, Jermaine stood on the restored cabin porch watching children from the local communities play in what was now a memorial park dedicated to Calvin Reed. A bronze plaque near the front door read, "Calvin Reed, scientist, environmentalist, hero. The truth always finds a way." Sarah Chen, who had won a Pulitzer Prize for her series of reports on the Hartwell case, joined him on the porch. "Any regrets?" she asked. Jermaine looked around at the property that had become not just his home, but a symbol of hope for communities that had suffered in silence for decades. In the distance, he could see Ruby Hayes guiding a group of students through the memorial garden, telling the story of her cousin who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. "None," he said. "Calvin chose this place to hide the truth. I just helped find it." A gentle breeze blew through the pines, carrying the clean scent of unpolluted air and the sound of children laughing. For the first time since coming home from the war, Jermaine Davis felt truly at peace. He had bought a home for $350 and found his purpose. Calvin Reed had died trying to save his community, but his work, his evidence, and his courage had finally triumphed. The truth, as the plaque said, always finds a way. And sometimes, it just needs someone brave enough to open the right door.